All right, y'all. We are back in Article 10, and I say that kind of loosely. Article 10's kind of been the diving board for us the last few weeks. But let's see, does anybody need this handout again? I got to keep one for me, but I got about 4 of them I can give out. Anybody need one of these? Or how many of you now? There's 2 of them in your vehicle. Yes, you want it back? Get you, Miss Brenda. You ain't been here for one, so I'll give you one. You got yours? Look at you, boy. All right, I got 2 left. Who wants one? Yeah, I got one. Okay, so we have been for a few weeks now, Article 10 on last things, and we walked through Article 10 and we looked at the specific things that it outlines about what we believe about last things, okay? And we broke that down, and we really said this article is about the things that we know for sure, okay? Like the basic outline of what the last things consist of, okay? So let's read it. Article 10 on last things. God, in his own time, in his own way, will bring the world to its appropriate end. According to his promise, Jesus Christ will return personally, visibly in glory to the earth. The dead will be raised, and Christ will judge all men in righteousness. The unrighteous will be consigned to hell, the place of everlasting punishment. The righteous in their resurrected and glorified bodies will receive their reward and will dwell forever in heaven with the Lord. And so one thing that we said about this statement of faith of what Southern Baptists believe, right, what we believe about last things, is that it's pretty vague, right? It's pretty vague. And it nails down the main things, which we said are this. We are in the last days now, right? The last days is that time from the resurrection, ascension of Jesus until the day that he returns, okay? That is the period known as the last days or the end of days, okay? We also know the world will end. The world will end. This world as we know it will come to an end in God's own time and way. We also know Christ will return. His return will be personal, visible, and glorious, okay? We know that there will be a bodily resurrection, okay? When he returns, there will be a resurrection of the dead. Believers raised in glory, okay? And unbelievers raised to judgment, okay? That's what Jesus says in John 5. We know following that resurrection, there's a judgment for all individuals. And then, following judgment, eternal destinies of either heaven or hell. And so what we said is there's some key things about last things that's noticeably missing from this statement. Words that we associate with last things like tribulation, millennium, or the number of times Jesus comes. There's debate about that, and we'll get into some of that tonight. The number of resurrections, okay? Or even the number of judgments. And our statement doesn't make definitive declarations about what we believe on those specific things because there is some disagreement among Bible-believing, Jesus-loving Christians and Southern Baptists, right? Okay? And so really we said a lot of the disagreement about those issues have to do with how we interpret a particular passage. And out of this passage, we get the idea of Christ's millennial reign, okay? And so that's what we've been looking at for the last couple of weeks. And so that passage is Revelation 20. So why don't we start by reading it? And this will be, I think, the 3rd time we've read it, but I just want to put it before you each week. So Revelation 20, verse 1. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. So that's where we get that word millennium from. What does millennium mean? 1,000. Okay, 1,000 years. Verse 3, and threw him into the pit and shut it and sealed it over him so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released for a little while. Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. Also, I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image, had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for how long? 1,000 years. Okay, the millennium. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. Okay? So from this passage, we get the idea of the millennial reign. Okay? The millennial reign. And I put together this handout for you that has the 4 major views on the millennium. Okay? And so what we did the previous 2 weeks is walk through 2 of these views. Okay? The first view and the second view. And the first view we looked at is called amillennialism. Okay? Amillennialism. And it says, or we'll do summary / trivia. Okay? When is the millennial reign of Christ according to amillennialism? It's now. Good. It's now. Okay? The 1,000 years, according to amillennialism, is symbolic and just represents a long period of time. Right? So it's not a physical reign of Christ on the earth, okay? But instead, it's a spiritual reign. A spiritual reign of Christ in heaven, and the saints who reign with him are who? Yes, it's a spiritual reign, and they interpret the first resurrection in Revelation 20 as what we'd said was the intermediate state, right? That when a believer who trusts in Jesus dies, their soul goes on to be in the presence of the Lord in heaven, okay? So they say that's the millennium. That is the reign of the saints with Christ. It's now, it's spiritual, it's in heaven, okay? They say that Satan is bound now during this time in the sense that he can't deceive the nations so that the gospel is preached across the world. And then, after that period of time, Jesus returns. Satan is finally defeated. Okay? The rebellion, what we call the Battle of Armageddon, Jesus finally defeats the enemies there. Then there is one physical resurrection of believers to glory, unbelievers to judgment. The believers who are alive when Jesus returns, what happens to them? They are called up to meet the Lord in the air. They are changed in the twinkling of an eye, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. And then they come onto the earth with the Lord at that time. Then there's final judgment, the great white throne judgment in Revelation 20. And then there's the establishment of the new heavens and the new earth and eternity. Okay? That's the way it goes in millennialism. Okay? Last week we looked at a different view called post-millennialism. Okay? Post-millennialism. And when does post-millennialism say the millennium is? It says that the millennium comes when? After Jesus comes. Okay? Post meaning after. So the idea in post-millennialism is that believers on earth, through the preaching of the gospel spreads across the world and it changes the world, right? And The idea is that there is this improvement and moral progression across history as the world is won to Jesus, that's what brings the millennium in, okay? So the millennium, again, kind of like amillennialism, is not a physical reign of Jesus on the earth, but it is his reign through the preaching of the gospel, okay? It's called the golden age of gospel advancement, is what they call it. So as the gospel goes across the world, people are won to Jesus, there is this improvement in the world, and that brings the millennium, okay? And then, after this millennium is over, then Jesus returns, okay? And we looked at millennialism in detail last week, but they say kind of the same thing amillennialism says about the binding of Satan, that his binding is now in the sense that the gospel can advance, he can't deceive, so that the world, through the progress of the gospel, morally progresses, okay? And that 1,000 years is not a literal 1,000 years, but like amillennialism is symbolic for a long period of time. At the end of the millennium, at the very end, Satan is loosed, okay? Just like we see in Revelation 20, right? He's loosed for a time. There's a great rebellion that culminates in what we call the Battle of Armageddon. And Christ defeats his enemies there at his return. And when he returns, there is that one physical resurrection, believers to glory, unbelievers to judgment. And the same thing in amillennialism, the believers who are alive at his coming are caught up in the air to meet him and are changed, and they descend onto the earth with Jesus. And then there is the new heavens and new earth, okay? So questions about amillennialism or postmillennialism before we move on to the next view. We feel pretty good about what those views see, right? Okay. So now we turn to premillennialism, okay? And my intention was that we would look at both views tonight in detail, and we're just not going to be able to do it. So what I hope to do tonight is talk about the basic beliefs of premillennialism that both views hold to, okay? So I guess the first question then is, as we look at what's called historic premillennialism and then dispensational premillennialism, okay? Both of those views agree on at least one big thing, okay? And the answer is in that word premillennialism, okay? So, what does a premillennial believe about the return of Jesus and the millennium? What does pre mean? Before, okay? Before. And so, the idea is Jesus returns before the millennium, okay? That's what that means. So the millennium starts when he returns, okay? And that is a big distinction from the other two views, right? Amillennialism, the millennium is now. It's not something that's coming, it's something that's happening, okay? Throughout the whole age of the church is the millennium. And then millennialism says Jesus comes after the millennium, okay? So premillennialism then is the view that Christ returns before the millennium. Mm-hmm. Not really. Not really. Yeah. It's kind of like you have to arrive at your view through something that's called inference, right? And that is, there's not one particular verse, one particular passage you can go to and say, this is the definitive answer. But what you can do is across the whole scope of the scriptures, infer what it's talking about, right? Does that make sense? Oh, for sure. But, there's clarity in what the main things are, okay? Right, like all four views, they say Jesus is returning, okay? When he comes, there's a final defeat of his enemies. He's coming in glory and power. When he comes, there is a resurrection of believers and unbelievers. Believers will be glorified. When he comes, those who are alive will be transformed and changed, right? Like all these, like we know for sure. No, it's right. It's the pursuit of trying to understand not the what, but the how. Right? Right. Like the what is for sure. What's going to happen? Jesus is coming, enemies defeated, resurrection, glory, right? Like all those things are the what, and we know them for sure, okay? But the question is, okay, how does he do it? And then there's confusion there, okay? Well, so we think that he does, all right? And so I was having a conversation with somebody this past week. We were talking about the book of Revelation. And so one of the things to keep in mind, Revelation, and then there's other writings, Ezekiel, Daniel, Zechariah. These are all what we call apocalyptic literature, okay? And usually when we hear that word apocalyptic, we think of, oh, this is like a disaster, right? That's what we equate apocalypse with. But the Greek word simply means, does anybody know what it means? Apocalypse, apocalypso. It means to reveal. It means to unfold. It literally means to remove the veil. And so John says in John chapter 1, this is the revelation, or the word is apocalypso. This is the apocalypse of Jesus Christ, right? And so what he's saying is, in this book, there is this unveiling, this revelation of these things. But the problem is, apocalypse literature uses pictures and symbols, right? It uses pictures and symbols to unveil its message. And so I was having this conversation with this guy, and I said, it's the same thing as like we read poetry differently than we read historic biographies, okay? Because we know if somebody's writing a poem, they may talk about like think about the Psalms. That's poetry, right? It talks about the trees singing and clapping, okay? We know we shouldn't read that and say, oh, trees literally clap, right? No, it's a picture, right? It's a symbol of praise. The same thing happens in apocalyptic literature. When we're reading those, it's a matter of, can we interpret the symbol, right? So the meaning's there. We have to do the work to interpret it and to interpret it rightly. And so where the divergence in the views is, how do we interpret the symbols, okay? And then, if you really want to get down to that it can be more complicated, is that, especially in Revelation, where is John getting his pictures and symbols from? Does anybody know? It's not the world around him. It's the Old Testament. He's using visions, symbols, pictures, even numbers that he's getting from the Old Testament, especially places like Daniel chapter 9, Ezekiel 30 through 42, Isaiah, Zechariah 14, like all these places. And when you read those, it's apocalyptic literature. And what is the author using for his message? Pictures and symbols. And so John is taking the pictures and symbols in the Old Testament and he's using them in the New Testament. And so Our problem is when John was writing, the people he wrote to, they would have read the symbols and the pictures, and they would have known immediately what he's talking about. Does that make sense? Like, they would know, oh, this is from this is what that means, okay? Now, here we are. We're 2,000 years removed, okay? And we have to connect the pictures and the symbols to what John is pointing us back to in the Old Testament. And that's difficult, okay? Without a doubt, the most difficult literature to interpret in the Bible is apocalyptic literature because it's heavy on symbols and pictures. And to get to the meaning, which the author knows, which his readers know, we have to determine what's the picture, what's the symbol, okay? And in my view, that can be a little more difficult because I believe some things in Revelation are literal and some things in Revelation are symbolic, okay? So, in my mind, almost all the numbers in Revelation are symbolic. I don't think hardly any of the numbers are literal periods of time. The same can go for, well, like Daniel chapter 9. How many of you have heard of Daniel's 70 weeks? Okay. His 70 weeks are 70 periods of 7 years. And we know that because he says it's 490 years. Okay, 7 periods of 7 years. And if you read Daniel chapter 9, he goes through these 69 weeks, which is 69 periods of 7 years. And he says at the end of this 69 period of 7 years, the Christ will be cut off. And what is he talking about? He's talking about the cross. He's talking about the crucifixion. And so then that leaves, okay, there's one more year left, okay? And then, just to say, this is why it's difficult to interpret, right? If you are a dispensational premillennial, then you say that last 7 years is a literal 7-year period of what? Anybody know? Tribulation. You say that last week in Daniel is the 7 years of tribulation. That's that last week of 7, okay? But what I would say is that the 7 is a representative number of the time between the crucifixion of Christ till his coming. Does that make sense? So, and I know that's difficult, right? Like, so in my mind, what makes that hard is I have to say, okay, yes, the first 69 weeks of Daniel was a literal period of time of 70 times, or 69 times 7, okay? But that last one is symbolic. Do you see what I'm saying? And we have to use the symbols and pictures in the way that the author intended to use it. And I think that's the way John uses it. That last week of 7, okay, 7 is representative of a fullness of time. And so, yes, that week of 7, I think it started, that last week of Daniel, I think it started when Jesus ascended into heaven. And when does it end? When he returns. And that whole period of time is marked for the church, for God's people, by tribulation. So in my view, and we'll get there, maybe not tonight, the Great Tribulation, right, is not a literal 7-year period that God snatches the church out of, but it's the whole experience of the church. From the moment Jesus died and rose and ascended till the moment he returns, what marks the experience of believers in the world? Jesus told us you're going to be hated, you're going to be persecuted, right? That's why it can be complicated. I don't know if I helped at all. Okay, well, maybe it was beneficial. Sure, right. Yeah, right. some people hold to these views so tightly that if you don't hold to one of these particular views, then like you're basically a heretic. Okay? You know what I mean? Like, there are churches, even in our area, like if you're not a dispensational premillennial, then you're just anathema, you're cursed, okay? Because you don't agree with what they say. And why I'm introducing all of us to these four views is it's fine to hold to any of them, right? It's still faithful. It still believes the main things that we've highlighted so far, okay? And again, that goes back to the what. What's going to happen? And then the confusion comes in trying to answer the question of how. How does it work out? And again, it all has to do with reading apocalyptic literature rightly and interpreting the symbols and pictures in the way John intended us to interpret. Okay? And that takes work. Lots and lots of work. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's tier one things that you have to believe in order to be a Christian, okay? The atoning death of Jesus, the Trinity, right? The divinity of the Son, like the bodily resurrection, like that's tier one, okay? Big deals. And then under that, I would say tier two would be something like baptism, okay? Lord's Supper. Can you be a Christian and sprinkle for baptism? Yes. Okay? You can. I believe there are good Christian people in Methodist churches that love the Lord. Okay? Does that mean I'm going to go join a Methodist church? No. Okay? That's why if a Methodist wants to join our church and they've only been sprinkled, they got to be immersed. Okay? And then there's like tier three stuff, and this is one, millennial views, right? Where you can be a member of the same church, and you may be an amillennial, and I may be a historic premillennial, and guess what? We can still fellowship together, okay? We can be a part of the same church. So yeah, there's levels to what we believe and whether or not it constitutes what, if someone's a Christian, if we can fellowship together in the same membership of a church or not, okay? All right, other questions about some of that stuff? All right, so let's talk about premillennialism in general, okay? Premillennialism in general, and really what these two hold together, right? What they believe together, the shared views of historic premillennialism and dispensational premillennialism, okay? So both of these views hold that Jesus will return physically to the earth before the 1,000-year reign of Christ, okay? So in both views, right, when we read Revelation 20, how does a premillennial interpret when Revelation 20 takes place? After Jesus comes, okay? So that is very different than the other views. Amillennialism teaches that the millennium is not something that's coming in the future, it's happening right now, okay? Postmillennialism believes that the millennium comes and then Jesus comes. So premillennialism is distinguished from those views in this fact. Jesus comes and then the millennium, okay? And both of these views, historic and dispensational premillennialism, believe that, okay? Both of these views take Revelation 20 in sequence, or maybe better to say Revelation 19 and 20 in sequence, okay? So if you have your Bible open, okay, look at Revelation 19, okay? And I pointed this out when we were walking through amillennialism, okay? Because an amillennial has to say Revelation 19 and 20 are not in sequence. And what that means is they believe that Revelation 19 gives us the description of when Christ comes, okay? But that Revelation 20 doesn't necessarily happen after that. okay? Instead, Revelation 20 is a telling of what's happening all throughout church history, okay? Now, a premillennial comes to Revelation 20 and says, no, it's in sequence, right? So if you look at Revelation 19, 11 through 21, what's happening in those verses? It's the return of Christ, okay? When he comes, he defeats his enemy. He throws the false prophet and the beast in the lake of fire. And we get these hints that these things are happening in a sequence, okay? So verse 11 of Revelation 19, then I saw. Verse 17, then I saw. And then after the return of Christ in Revelation 19, you turn to Revelation 20, and verse 1 says what? Then. So a premillennial reads that and says, John is describing a sequence, okay? Jesus returns, then there's the millennium. Does that make sense? Right? And the other views have to say, no, it's a retelling of all of history when you get to chapter 20. So what I'm saying is, for a premillennial, the 1,000-year reign of Christ is something that will happen in the future, okay? The millennium is yet to come, but it's coming, okay? Both of these views also agree that the binding of Satan in Revelation 20 is something that's future, okay? It hasn't happened yet. And that's distinct from the other two views, because when do they say Satan is bound? Both of them say now, right? A non-millennial and a post-millennial say, yes, Satan is bound now, right? And a premillennial says, no, that is a literal future event that hasn't happened yet, okay? Because we see that for as long as Christ reigns on the earth in the millennium, Satan is not only bound, but what else is he? He's thrown in a pit. And then what happens to that pit? It's sealed. It's sealed, right? So when we read the scriptures, it does not read as if this is this is true of Satan right now in the present, right? That he's tied up, thrown in a pit, and it's sealed so that he can't get out, right? Isn't that the point of sealing a pit? So that he can't get out, right? And so a premillennial says, well, that's something that's coming later in the future, not presently, okay? Now, to make it a little more complicated, right? Premillennials on both of these views can say the 1,000 years is literal or symbolic, right? So you can be dispensational premillennial and say the 1,000 years is symbolic for a long period of time. You can be a historic premillennial and say the 1,000 years is symbolic for a long period of time, okay? But both views say if it's a literal 1,000 years or if it's symbolic for a long period of time, when Jesus comes, he will establish his millennial reign. And listen, here's the main thing. It will be a physical, earthly reign, okay? Like he will be present bodily and physically on the earth to reign for 1,000 years, whether that's literal or symbolic, okay? And the saints reign with him during that time, okay? That's what Revelation 20 describes, a period of Jesus' reign for 1,000 years and the reign of those who have trusted in him during that 1,000 years. So, that's very different, right? The other two views say, no, Jesus does not establish a physical, earthly reign on the earth, okay, for this 1,000 years, right? No, amillennial says it's spiritual and it's happening now in heaven. So that's not on the earth, is it? No. Postmillennialism says that it comes through the hearts of Christians as they believe the gospel. So Jesus isn't physically on the earth reigning, but he's reigning through the hearts of believers all across the world, okay? But premillennial says, no. Jesus returns, he defeats his enemies, and then physically on the earth, he reigns. So, now we do inference. Okay, that's what I was talking about. Now we do some inference and we say, is there other scriptures we can look at and infer from this that Jesus will physically reign on the earth? Okay? And so I got at least two for you, I think. Look at Zechariah 14. And Zechariah 14 is describing what's known as the day of the Lord, or the way the New Testament speaks of it is the second coming of Jesus. Okay? So Zechariah 14, verse 3. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. And then verse 4 is the big deal I want you to look at. On that day, his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives. See that? Okay. So a premillennial looks at Zechariah 14 and says, oh yeah, his feet are literally on the Mount of Olives on this day, on the day of the Lord. Okay? Now, is the Mount of Olives a real place on the earth? Oh yeah, I've stood on it in Israel. Okay, it's just outside of Jerusalem. All right, keep reading. That lies before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west by a very wide valley, so that one half of the mount shall move northward, and the other half southward. And you shall flee to the valley of my mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach to Azel, and you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. Now, a premillennial is going to say, this is describing the second coming of Jesus, right? He will come, and then who are the holy ones that come with him? Yeah. A premillennial is going to say, well, that's talking about the saints who will be raised to reign with Jesus when he comes. Okay? All right? On that day there shall be no light, cold, or frost. There shall be a unique day which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but at evening time there shall be light. On that day living water shall flow out from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea, half of them to the western sea. It shall continue in summer as in winter. And then again, verse 9, we should really look at. And the Lord will be king over what? All the earth. On that day the Lord will be one, and his name one. Okay? So Zechariah is describing this day of the Lord, this second coming of Jesus is how we interpret it, right? And he says on that day, when the Lord comes, he comes and he wages war against the nations, right? That's right there in the first couple verses. He's going to wage war against the nations. He's going to defeat his enemies. And when he comes, he will be physically present on the earth. And with him are the holy ones, which we interpret as resurrected believers. Resurrected believers. And his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives. And once his enemies are defeated, that establishes his reign on the earth as king. That's a physical earthly reign, right? I think. Okay, because I'm a premillennial. And what I want to do is, I want to put beside, and this may be the only thing that we have time left to do, I want to put beside Zechariah 14, Revelation 19. Okay? And I think this description in Zechariah 14 fits side by side with what's described in Revelation 19. Okay? So I want to read 19:11 through 21. And 19:11 through 21 is the description of Christ's return, his second coming. Okay? It says this, Then I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness, what does he do? He judges and makes war. Okay? Same thing that on the day of the Lord comes and does in Zechariah 14. Okay? His eyes are like a flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems, and he has a name written that no one knows but himself. He's clothed in a robe dipped in blood, and the name by which he's called is the Word of God. And the armies of heaven, arrayed in fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. From his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. You see that? Rule, reign. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty. On his robe and on his thigh he has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Verse 17, then I saw an angel standing in the sun. With a loud voice he called to all the birds that fly directly overhead, come, gather for the great supper of God, to eat the flesh of the kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of mighty men, the flesh of horses and their riders, and the flesh of all men, both free and slave, both small and great. And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth with their armies gathered to make war against him who is sitting on the horse and against his army. And the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet who in its presence had done the signs by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped its image. These two were thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur. And the rest were slain by the sword that came from the mouth of him who was sitting on the horse. And all the birds were gorged with their flesh. So when he comes, okay, if we put Zechariah 14 and Revelation 19 side by side, there's this battle that takes place, okay? He defeats his enemies. Kings and nations are slain. The false prophet and beast are thrown in the lake of fire. And then the next thing that happens in Revelation chapter 20 is what? The millennium reign. He reigns for 1,000 years. Satan is bound, and he reigns on the earth, okay? Now, something interesting, okay? Look back at Zechariah 14, okay? Zechariah 14. So in Zechariah 14, 16 through 17, something interesting happens after Jesus comes and this battle takes place, and he physically on the earth establishes his reign as king, which we call the millennium. So look at verse 16. Then everyone who survives of all the nations that have come against Jerusalem shall go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts. So you see, Zechariah, Revelation describes this great battle that takes place between Jesus and these nations and false prophet and beast, okay? They're defeated, but they're survivors. Do you see that? It's right there in Zechariah. There are survivors who remain when Jesus comes. All right, let's keep reading it. Everyone who survives of all the nations that come against Jerusalem shall go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, to keep the Feast of Booths. And if any of the families of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain on them. Okay? So Zechariah 14 describes this day of the Lord, this coming of Jesus, this great battle. Kings and nations are defeated. Christ establishes his reign on the earth. And then those who survive the battle, who live, are commanded to do what? Worship the King. Worship this King who has established his reign on the earth. And we see that during this time, they can even rebel against the King, can't they? If they decide not to go, then the Lord will withhold rain. And then if you keep reading in Zechariah 14, plagues will come on them. Okay? And so, a premillennial, okay, says this is a description of the second coming of Jesus and what it looks like on the earth during the millennial reign of Jesus. Okay? And so, you see on your, I'll have to talk about it more next week. I'm just almost out of time. But you see it on, where's it at? I thought I put it on here. Okay, yeah, all right. The second sheet, it says comparison handout, and it has millennium, Christ's return category on one side. Y'all see that? It should be the back of your first page, I think. All right, so if you go over to where it says historic premillennialism, and you go down to where it says key challenges, it says this. Here's the challenge of historic premillennialism, okay? It must explain life in the millennium with glorified believers and also non-glorified living together, right? So, what a premillennial says, both historic and dispensational, is that when Jesus returns, this battle takes place, he defeats his enemies, nations are crushed, kings are removed, and yet he comes, there's this glorification of believers, there's the millennial reign of Jesus on the earth, and yet there are survivors left on the earth who oppose him. Okay? So during the millennium reign, you have Jesus' visible glory on the earth, reigning as king, and you have believers in glorified body reigning with him on the earth, and also present on the earth are non-glorified, even unbelievers. Have y'all ever heard that before? Anybody before? Okay. What do y'all think about that? Or are you wondering what I think about that? Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's true. I think Zechariah 14 is describing when the Lord returns, when he crushes his enemies, when he establishes his reign as Lord and King on the earth with his holy ones, and yet, at the same time, there are those on the earth who survive and who even have the capacity to rebel against his kingship. So, who could that describe? Unglorified people, right? I have other arguments for why that's true. If you want to go and study this week, Isaiah 65, okay? Isaiah 65 envisions this period of time when babies are born and none of them die at birth. Anybody ever heard that before, Isaiah 65? The lamb lies down with the lion. There's this period of time on the earth when babies play with snakes and aren't bitten. That's Isaiah 65. You can look it up, Isaiah 65, okay? And what I'm saying is, Isaiah 65 says this is a time on the earth when this is true, right? Isaiah 65 even says that there's this period of time on the earth when no one dies young, that everyone lives to be old. It says to 100, okay? So babies don't die in birth. Everyone grows old. No one dies young. Anybody ever know anybody on the earth right now who died young? Okay? So Isaiah 65 has to be describing a time in the future that's different than our time now, okay? And yet it's still on the earth, and it's a time when people still die. Okay? So it's not eternal state, it's not new heavens and new earth. Then what period of time can it be? And my answer is, it's the millennium. Has to be, right? When Jesus reigns on the earth, the benefits and blessing, listen, it flows to all people. All people. So that non-glorified people in the millennium who have children, okay, experience the blessing of not having to worry about that child dying in birth. Those alive during the millennium, unglorified, don't have to worry about getting cancer when they're 40 and dying. Isaiah 65 describes this time of peace and goodness where the blessing of Christ, listen, it is reversing the effects of the curse on this world. Right? And my thing is, that can only happen if there is a physical, earthly reign of Jesus on the world, okay, that is not new heavens, new earth, eternal state, okay, because it's the same earth. And yet, it's a period of time that is unlike our experience now. So something has to be different in that. I'm sorry I cut you off. Absolutely, yeah. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to have to stop here. I wish we could keep going. So next week, we'll finish talking about, okay, where these views agree, and then we'll get off into, okay, where do they start diverging from one another, okay? Any last question or word? Yeah. I think so. I hope you do too. Any others? If you want to chat about it more, I'll be here for a little longer. Come find me.